So let's talk about the respiratory system. So respiration is interesting. It's definitely a place in evolution where different solutions have been found. And the whole reason why we have a respiratory system is because it would take way too long for oxygen to get into our bodies if it just diffused through the air in our skin. Like you might be thinking, oh, there's so much oxygen in the air. Can't it just get into our bodies? That's actually how the insects work. They have little holes and the oxygen has to come in just kind of randomly, which means that they can't get very big because by the time oxygen just randomly got through these tubes to the center, if they were very big, they would be dead. So that's one reason why insects are definitely reliant on how much oxygen is in the atmosphere for how big they can get. So humans, mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, lizards, everything else that is bigger than insects has to have some sort of respiration system where they bring in air at some point and then do some kind of gas exchange and then let it out again. So what you're seeing here in the humans is the diaphragm is what causes inhalation and exhalation. So when the diaphragm contracts, it causes the lungs to fill up. So here it's contracting, oh, the lungs fill up. It contracts, let's go, the lungs fill up. And then what's happening is in the lungs, you get oxygen comes in, and then CO2 leaves. Okay, so same thing happens in the birds, but the birds are interesting because they have a two-way system while we have a one-way system. They also have all these sacs that are in different places, very different from how our lungs work. There's a lot of weird history of back when people would do animal cruelty as a fun way to entertain people. This one scientist was trying to show how birds can fly, and he took so this is the Victorian era, they didn't have movies, so you either went to plays at night, you went to bars, or you went to see a scientist. And they were kind of stage people, and this one guy got up on stage and he had a raven, and he said, look at this amazing thing that ravens do, that birds do. And he filled up a pipe, he was smoking a pipe, he filled up his own lungs with smoke from the pipe, and then he blew it into the bird's face, and then closed up the poor bird's beak and nostrils, and then cut off a wing. And then you just see the air just slowly come out of the wing. And what he had done was nick one of these sacs that also kind of goes into the wing a little bit, and then he's like, see, the birds are filled with air. Well, they're not, but lungs are kind of little big air sacs. Really what is happening is they have all these little tiny air sacs, and that's what we're going to get into today, how the human works and how we're full of lots of tiny little air sacs in very specific places, and why we're like that anyway. So the respiratory system has four big functions. It's involved in gas exchange. It's definitely the most important part of it. It's how we produce sound. It's how we smell things. And it actually is really important in acid and base balance, which we've talked about a little bit, but not in very great detail. So acid is the presence of hydrogen ions. It gets a little more complicated than that, but that's going to be, we'll get into more of it. Bases can be just as dangerous as acids, depending on how strong they are, so don't let that fool you. But we're going to talk about, my own respiratory tract is a bit upset today, I'm very stuffy. We're going to talk about how the respiratory system is broken up into the upper and lower respiratory tracts. So the upper tract is we'll get into it, but it's common to both air and food, whereas our lower tract is only used for air exchange. We'll get into that. So we've talked about cellular respiration about, it seems, millions of years ago now, when we talked about ATP and the mitochondria and the powerhouse of the cell, and oh my goodness. And what does that mean? How does that relate to respiration in the case of the respiratory system? We're actually very closely related. Respiration, if you just call it respiration, it's the exchange of gases, so oxygen and carbon dioxide, between the body and the external atmosphere. So it's using the gases in the atmosphere to bring oxygen into our body and to let go of carbon dioxide. And the only reason why we do that is because cellular respiration needs that oxygen in order to make ATP. Remember, ATP is that currency, that energy currency in our body. Without it, we are dead. And so the only reason why we take in oxygen is to fuel this ATP production. ATP is what we need to power all of our, or at least a very great percentage of our cellular activities. So it's very, very important. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about the upper respiratory tract. So this involves what does it involve? It involves the nose, the pharynx, part of the throat, well, the throat. Okay, so the nasal cavity, that's what's stuffed up on me right now, so I sound ridiculous. It's divided into two cavities by the nasal septum. So remember last week I talked about the heart has a septum, and it's just an area of cartilage or tissue that separates two cavities. So our nasal septum is made of bone and cartilage, okay? It separates our nostrils. Our nostrils also have nose hairs, which are actually used to filter air, not just catch boogers, but actually those boogers are very important. So our mucous membrane traps bacteria and dirt and moistens the air as it comes into our body. If you've ever been in a place that has really, really dry air, it kind of hurts to breathe it a little bit. It definitely feels different. Our nose is really good at warming that air up and wetting it, moistening it. We also have a bunch of capillaries in this, and that's really important because in this conky, which you learned about when you learned about the bones, this is an area where the air is allowed to warm up so that as it goes into our lungs, it doesn't slow things down by being too cold. And we have these olfactory receptors because while we're breathing in that air, we might as well be smelling too. So we have all these olfactory receptors at the top of this nasal cavity in that cribriform plate, which we learned about when we learned about the skull bones. And so that is allowing your body to take in chemical signals and analyze an environment. So are you smelling food? Are you smelling something dangerous? Are you smelling toxins? Are you smelling a potential mate? So this is something that animals like birds don't have. They don't have a sense of smell. At least most of them don't have a sense of smell. So their nostrils are just used for breathing. We actually use the nostrils for both breathing and for smelling. Okay, so what's up with sinuses? Why are mine trying to destroy me currently because of allergies? Ugh. Okay, so what's up with sinuses? Sinuses are spaces within our skull. We talked about these a little bit before. They're very important because they reduce the weight of the skull. If we didn't have these sinuses, our skull would be so much heavier. We'd have to have much thicker necks in order to hold up our heads. Who even knows what would happen? They are filled with air, which means they act as resonating chambers for our voices. So if you've ever heard your voice on a recording and thought, oh my God, is that what I sound like? Well, what you sound like in your head is while it's still reverberating before it leaves your mouth. And so it's resonating within these sinuses before it actually leaves your face. So you're hearing kind of this pre-sound when you hear it yourself. And then when it comes out, it's going to sound a little bit different. The sound quality changes because it's already left all of those resonating chambers after you've already heard it, basically. So that's why it sounds different to you. So the lovely thing about the sinus infection is that the sinuses is that they're full of mucus because they're, again, interacting with the environment. Anytime you have an interaction with the environment, you want to protect yourself from viruses and any other kinds of nastiness. So you want to either be able to close it up tight like a sphincter, which you don't want to do with your nose because you didn't breathe through it all the time. So instead you fill it up with mucus. And so in the case of sinuses, it can get filled up with mucus, and if there's something in there that's really irritating them, they can become infected. So this creates a lot of pressure, and because the immune system's coming in to fight whatever it can, and that can push on the neurons in the area and become very painful. So that is how sinus infection works. So what else do we have? We have these nasolacrimal ducts. And remember, the lacrimal duct is not just here so that you can cry over anatomy. It's so that you can wash the eyes and feed the cornea. So the nasolacrimal duct, which is here, drains tears to the nasal cavity. So if you're not literally crying them down your face, they just go right into your nasal cavity, which is why if you have lacrimation, if you cry, your nose gets really runny because you're producing a whole lot of fluid and it's pushing through the nasal cavity and then it's pushing all the mucus in your nasal cavity out, so you get a runny nose. It's very pretty. If someone says they have a big ugly cry, they're usually talking about just how they're just snotty, snotty, snotty. What else do we have in our upper respiratory system? We have the uvula, which is the hanging bit at the back of our throat. So this is really important because this closes off your mouth when you sneeze. That means that you're pushing a very great force of air from your lungs out through your nose because something has irritated your nose and your body's trying to get rid of it. So why does this happen when we're cold? I actually don't know. It's a good question. I have no idea. But it does. it could have something to do with the fact that when you're colder, you actually can't fight off infections as easily. So maybe your body's trying even harder to get rid of any potential breathed in pathogens. I have no idea. But so your uvula, when you sneeze, your head goes forward. The uvula covers up the mouth part. It doesn't really look like it could, but it does, so that you can't sneeze out your mouth. It's really hard to sneeze out your mouth. This is actually the uvula. Also, when you snore, if you tilt your head back, it kind of it partially covers up the respiratory tract, and so you can it causes snoring if you're breathing through your mouth, because you kind of just get that raspy noise from it. Okay, so what is the pharynx? So the pharynx is a common chamber for both respiration and digestion. So that's going to be anything. You've got the nasopharynx, which is the nose to the pharynx. You have the oropharynx, which is your mouth to your epiglottis, and then your laryngopharynx, which is going to be the larynx, and just basically this general area that has the larynx also. So anywhere where food can come into contact with air, that's going to be your pharynx. Okay, so you could potentially you could snort food out your nose if you're, you have a spit take, or you are laughing so hard, or when something happens, you snort milk out of your nose, like we all do at least once when we're elementary school students. Usually food should stay in the oropharynx. So you're taking in food here, it goes down the throat, and then it has to determine, is it going to go down where it's supposed to, down the esophagus, or are you going to choke on it when it goes down the trachea? So that is not the optimal thing. So this is the epiglottis, and it's a flap of tissue so that when you eat food, it basically works like a pinball flipper, kind of, and when food's coming down, the epiglottis closes over the trachea so that food can't go that way, and food instead goes down the trachea, or sorry, down the esophagus, which is the food tube. So you can imagine when you're choking, what happens is the epiglottis fails at a point, and food gets lodged in the trachea instead, and it can't be pushed out. So they have these cartilage rings in the trachea to keep it open so that you can always breathe. But usually food gets lodged, like the epiglottis will close while the food's trying to get into the trachea. It's very painful. There's a bunch of nerves there, and it's important for it to be painful so that you know, I need to cough this up and get it out of my trachea before it blocks my lung. So that's what's happening there. Something interesting to point out is the tongue. It's a huge muscle, and part of what it does is move food around to different parts of the mouth, and then also push it back into the throat so it can be swallowed. Anything else exciting? We're going to get into the larynx very soon. Alright, there's the larynx. So what's happening with the larynx? This should look kind of familiar because we talked about the hyoid bone is here. We talked about how the thyroid sits about here and is a producer of hormones. What else is happening? So there's a thyroid cartilage. The thyroid sits here. So what is the larynx? So the larynx supports the vocal cords. It's a bunch of cartilage, and your vocal cords, this is if you look behind it, your vocal cords are here, and they're muscles that we blow air over, and they vibrate so that we make the noises we make when we speak. I'm not good at that today. Okay. What else is going on? We have our epiglottis and our thyroid gland. So the whole point of the larynx is to control airflow. So we're either controlling it so that we are not choking on food, so our epiglottis is involved, or we're controlling it so that we can make sound. So we have different kinds of cartilage. We have thyroid cartilage and cricoid cartilage and hyoid cartilage, blah, blah, blah. Several different kinds of cartilage keep the larynx in place, so that's very important. And anytime you're swallowing food, again, that epiglottis is going to flap down. So this is the epiglottis. It's going to flap down to cover the airway so that your food doesn't get into your lungs and make it hard to breathe. So this is a random weirdo fact that I learned from an episode of Bones, but anytime you have someone who's died of strangulation, almost always the hyoid bone is what's affected. So if someone is trying to strangle someone, they're trying to cut off their airway, people don't realize there's a bone there, and it's if you're putting enough pressure on this, it's going to break. And so that's fun fact. Okay. So what are we looking at here? This is if you were to take a camera and look down into the larynx. And people do this. There was an interesting documentary called The Human Machine, and it looked at Steven Tyler of Aerosmith and how his larynx works. And what happens is when the vocal cords come together, they kind of smack shut. So we have things like guttural stops. Like if you say mountain versus mountain, you're making different sounds with your throat. And if you have a guttural stop, you're basically closing these really hard, okay? So if you're someone who sings or speaks for a living, you're using these muscles a lot more and you're smacking them into each other more so they can break down more easily. And that's not great. So in this documentary, they say, hey, Steven Tyler, we really want to watch your vocal cords. And he says, cool, but you have to fix them. And so what's happening with him is he's having vocal bleeds. So these are the vocal cords, and they just start bleeding, and he can't sing. And so they go in and they basically zap them closed. They cauterize them, which is fine because, you know, if you have a vein right here and you cut it, you close it right here, well, the blood will just get shunted somewhere else, and then the whole area can still be fed by those nutrients and that oxygen. And it's very interesting. I highly recommend going and looking at The Human Machine, at least for the speaking part of it. Okay, so this is looking down into the larynx. These are the vocal cords. They are folds of epithelia, and they contain elastic fibers. So the whole point of the vocal cords are to help us speak. Okay, so the glottis is just this open area. So interestingly, the vocal cords, there's some muscular tissue in there, and just like any other muscle, when you hit it with testosterone, they get a lot bigger. So which is why when boys hit puberty, they get a huge rush of testosterone. Well, their vocal cords get bigger, but they get bigger faster than they can control them, which is why their voices will crack a lot of times during puberty because they're still figuring out how to use them. Same thing happens in women. If you have more testosterone, women tend to produce more testosterone as they get older, and so their voices get deeper and deeper. So laryngitis so anytime you have itis, it means inflammation. So laryngitis is the inflammation of the larynx. For some reason in Latin, when you go from an X to any kind of ending, that X becomes a G. So laryngitis is inflammation of the larynx, and it causes your vocal cords to be less responsive because they just start swelling and they can't vibrate as well. So it's kind of like if you took a guitar string, a magical guitar string, because I can't think of a better analogy, and you soak it in water and then you try to strum it, but it's all full of water, and so it doesn't strum very well. That was a weird analogy. Let's just move on. Okay, so that was all the upper respiratory system. So we've got the nose, the mouth, and then we get into the pharynx, and here's the larynx, and there's the epiglottis that'll flap shut to close the trachea. Again, you can see those rings of cartilage on the trachea which keep it open. And then the esophagus is back here. That's all about food. So this is the whole region where we have to worry about choking because it's shared with both food and air. But then we get into the lower respiratory system, and that includes the respiratory tree. So this is the conducting portion of that. It's basically just the trachea. Here's again the larynx. There's some overlap here. And then we get to the yeah, I guess down here we're in the bronchus. So the bronchus, and then we have the bronchioles, where they get smaller and smaller. And then we're going to so this is all the conducting portion. You're just bringing air in. You're not doing anything with the air yet. You're just bringing it to the place where it can do stuff with the air. So once you get into smaller and smaller branches of the bronchioles, you get into the respiratory portion of the respiratory tree. And this is where gas exchange actually happens. So it's kind of like in the case of capillary beds where the blood cells can't do anything in the giant arteries, but as the arteries get smaller and smaller and they become arterioles and then they get to the capillary bed, well, in the capillary bed, they're finally slow enough and they're close enough to other things that they can finally start functioning. Well, turns out there are a bunch of capillaries covering what is called the alveoli, these little air sacs at the end of all of the respiratory tree. And that is just simple squamous tissue. It is a place where gas exchange can finally happen. So we're not going to focus on this, but this is an interesting thing to think about. Oh, I do want to point out the trachea is lined with cilia. So these are cilia. It's basically these little hair-like projections of cells here. And what the whole point of this is, the cilia, what they're doing is they move that mucus layer that just loves to, that's important to have anywhere where you have, again, an interaction with the environment. So if you're breathing in air, you want to have mucus around to catch any particles so it doesn't get trapped inside your lung where it could be more dangerous. And while that mucus is going to get filled with nastiness and get dirty, so as you're breathing, that mucus is going to be, the cilia helps pick that mucus up and just start moving it, moving it up like a bunch of hands passing it, and then it just flops it over into the esophagus so it can get sent to the digestive system and be destroyed. Well, anytime, so these are really important. They keep the mucus moving and they keep your lungs from just being full of nasty mucus. Well, anytime you smoke or use tobacco products, it kills the cilia. And so then that's why smokers get that smoker's cough. Part of it is that they can't move the mucus themselves, so instead they have to cough it up using, just using coughing mechanisms instead of the cilia. Okay, so let's talk about the differences between the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchiole. So trachea is just the big tube. So this is the trachea. It's always held very widely open by those cartilage rings, and the esophagus is behind it, and it's how we conduct food. But air goes through the trachea. As it leaves, it goes into the trachea. Once it goes past the larynx, we call this the bronchus, or the bronchi, because there's two of them. This again is just where air conduction happens, and it's made more of hyaline cartilage. And then this splits up into smaller and smaller things called bronchioles. And this, again, is for air conduction. It has actually no cartilage because it needs to be more spongy than cartilage can allow. This is an example of trachea after this is someone's trachea after they've died, and they've died of smoke inhalation. And so you can tell that this person died in a fire because they literally breathed in so much smoke that it coated their trachea. It's an interesting fun fact. Where the trachea, this is actually, sometimes it's hard for people to tell where the trachea ends and the bronchus begins. Really, we say if we've passed the larynx, we're in the bronchus. And so there are the bronchial branches, and then they're going to get into bronchioles as they get smaller and smaller. Okay, so what's at the end of those bronchioles? At the end of each bronchiole, we have this big old, I guess, bunch of grapes looking things, and each one of these is called an alveoli, or an alveolus, like a ravioli. This raviolus, I guess, would be a singular of a ravioli, if that's our analogy. But an alveolus is this little bubble. And so what this is that air is coming into this bubble, and it is then allowed to, it's so small, so it's really hard to see it because they're so small, so that they can, that air that's pushed in there can come into contact with the capillary beds, and the oxygen is going to be absorbed by the blood system. It passes through the alveolus into the capillary, and the carbon dioxide that's coming in can be passed out of the blood system and into the alveolus and then be breathed out. So all gas exchange is done in the alveoli. None of it's done in any other part of the respiratory system. And it all has to do with these gases diffusing across the simple squamous epithelia. So first it has to pass the alveoli membrane, and then it passes through the capillary membrane. But remember, the capillary has those really leaky tissues which allow for very easy transport of oxygen to and from it. Okay, so this might seem obvious, but how does breathing even work? So respiration requires ventilation. What does that mean? That means you have to be able to inhale and exhale. So how does this even work? So you have to be able to breathe in new air so that the change in the volume of the lungs in air will be exchanged. Basically, you change the volume of the lungs, and then air can be exchanged, okay? So if you, so it's different from in frogs, where frogs breathe through their skin, so they don't really have to breathe in and out to get it to work. They just have to go into different places. So we have to have what are called parietal and visceral pleura. So remember, pleura is what we remember, are those membranes that the visceral the parietal and visceral pleura are the membranes that surround the lungs. So they're basically the plastic sacs that they're not plastic. We use this as an analogy in class, but they're the sacs that surround the lungs. So the visceral pleura is the one that touches the lung, and then the parietal pleura touches the muscular wall around the lung. Okay, so these are really important. So when you inhale, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles all contract, and it pulls the ribs out like bucket handles and expands the pleural cavity. Okay, so when your rib muscles, which are each one of them is not a great big muscular thing, but when you contract all of them, they pull the ribs apart a little bit, and then as you're pulling down on your diaphragm, it causes the lungs to inflate. So it's not like you're breathing into a balloon, which is what it feels like we're doing, but it's like you have a balloon and you're sucking the whole balloon outside, and then it happens to fill up. It's a weird example, but it's the opposite of blowing into a balloon, which is what we think is happening. So what happens when you exhale? When you exhale, you're not actually, it feels like you're pushing that air out, but really what you're doing is you let all of those muscles relax, and then just the weight of your rib cage pushes back down on your lungs and pushes your air out. And that's it. That's all it takes. The air is driven out by just the relaxation of those muscles and the weight of your rib cage. So here's some interesting examples. So remember, this is the diaphragm. That's the most important one. All of these muscles are involved in respiration. So if you are trying to like really exhale air, trying to breathe it all out, you have to flex different muscles, and that's part of where this expiratory abdominis comes in. It's pushing down harder to get you to exhale even more. All right, so what else is happening? So let's first talk about why I mentioned those membranes. The whole point of those membranes are if we actually go back up to this, if you watch the diaphragm here, let's see if I can make this bigger. Apparently not. Okay, so watch what's happening with the diaphragm here. So this oversimplifies it a little bit because it doesn't show what's happening with the membranes. So the diaphragm contracts. But when the diaphragm contracts, it pulls on the parietal viscera, the parietal pleura, so that membrane, and then that membrane just kind of sucks the other membrane with it, and then that pulls the lungs. So the diaphragm itself does not actually touch the lungs. It's the pulling of the diaphragm pulling one membrane, which pulls the other membrane, which actually causes that inhalation. All right. Let's go back down to this. So what else is happening? We also have what's called pulmonary surfactant, and this is this fluid that keeps your lungs from collapsing and sticking together every time you exhale. That would be awful. Okay, you want to, if you've ever had a plastic bag, a wet plastic bag, and you've gotten the sides stuck together, and then you've tried to open it, it's incredibly hard because those two sides then stick to each other. Well, our lungs would do that if we didn't have this pulmonary surfactant. So our lungs are coated with this surfactant to keep them from sticking together. So this is an internal thing. So there is a kind of disease where premature infants lack adequate surfactant because they're born too early. Their bodies haven't started making it yet because they haven't been prepared to breathe oxygen that way yet. So they have to use breathing assistant, and sometimes it can be injected with artificial surfactant. Okay, so all gas exchange is done via diffusion. So we have to worry about these concentration gradients. So remember, diffusion is when you move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So in the alveoli, that's where we have the most oxygen. And so that is going to push all of that oxygen into the blood system. And then the blood is going to be going to tissues that need that oxygen. And then the tissues are going to be able to distribute, when you get into the tissues, you can distribute that oxygen to the individual cells. Now, on the carbon dioxide side, the cells are going to be where you have the most carbon dioxide, and then you're going to want to get rid of it, so then as the blood goes through, it can pick that up from the tissues and cells, and then take it to the alveoli and let it go. And part of how it does that, it has to do with that pH thing. So gas, how does gas get transported in our blood? So there is some oxygen that is dissolved in our plasma, but almost all of it, 97% of it, is bound to hemoglobin, that protein that we talked about last time, when we talked about blood. Carbon dioxide is a little more complicated. 9% of it gets dissolved in the plasma. Only 27% of it is bound to hemoglobin. It's in a different place than oxygen, but you can never have hemoglobin and oxygen bound at the same time. As soon as oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it changes the shape of it so it can't bind carbon dioxide, and vice versa. But most of the transport of carbon dioxide actually happens in the blood through something called bicarbonate. So this bicarbonate ion, it actually is a good system because if all of it had to be transported on the hemoglobin, we'd never get blood to stuff like our toes, or we'd never get oxygenated blood to stuff that are extremely far away because it would be just full of carbon dioxide instead of oxygen. Okay, so what happens? So we talked about hemoglobin when we talked about blood, but let's look at it again. So this binds to oxygen, carbon dioxide, and the hydrogen ion. So remember, these are the protein parts. Heme is the part that actually binds to oxygen. Oxygen will, so here's the thing. So all proteins have to be a certain shape in order to bind to anything, okay? Or to have stuff bind to them. To be functional, proteins have to be a certain shape. So if you want to let go of oxygen, so because you don't want hemoglobin to be bound to oxygen forever, the whole point of hemoglobin is to pick up oxygen, take it somewhere else, and then drop it off. So you have to be able to change the shape of hemoglobin so that you can leave oxygen someplace else. So there are some tricks to make sure that oxygen does become unbound from the hemoglobin to make sure it gets dropped off in places. So oxygen's not going to stay bound to hemoglobin if temperature is really high, if carbon dioxide is really high, and if acidity is high. Okay, so temperature being really high is important because you get really high temperatures in the digestive system. So if you have hemoglobin going by the digestive system, you want to drop off oxygen right away. Carbon dioxide, if you have tissue that has really high carbon dioxide, it's very important that you switch it out for oxygen before that tissue dies. And so it makes sense that if you have, this is actually a really good system, if carbon dioxide is really high, and you have hemoglobin coming in that's full of oxygen, you want hemoglobin to just give up that oxygen right away. So let's look at that acidity thing. What is going on there? So in our red blood cells, carbon dioxide and water enzymatically combine to make carbonic acid. So basically, anytime you have carbon dioxide and water, you get bicarbonate. So if you've ever opened a soda and seen the fizzing, that's, well, a better example is to think about like a bicarbonate medicine like Alka-Seltzer that you put in your water. It's a solid, you put it in water and it starts to fizz. So that is bicarbonate be releasing carbon dioxide. Well, in our blood, the opposite happens. You take the carbon dioxide and you shove it into that ionic form. So it's not exactly that little cake looking thing, but it's pretty similar. So that, well, it'll end up there. So that carbon dioxide plus water becomes carbonic acid, and then it starts to fall apart into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So you can imagine if there's a whole lot of carbon dioxide present, that means there's going to be, it's going to push through and you'll have a whole lot of hydrogen present. So if there's a whole lot of hydrogen present, then the hemoglobin that's around is going to start dumping off its oxygen so that it can pick up the carbon dioxide instead. Well, you don't want to pick it up. There might be more carbon dioxide than there's oxygen to be dropped off. So you need a different way to get more carbon dioxide to go away. And so if you have a whole bunch of carbon dioxide, you can push it into the bicarbonate ion, which can just travel through the blood by itself. That's awesome. If for some reason you have a whole lot of hydrogen ions and they're going around and being jerks and breaking stuff up and causing a bunch of trouble, well, it can actually push in the opposite direction and make carbon dioxide and water present, and then that carbon dioxide can be picked up by the hemoglobin and taken away that way. So there's actually, you can hold a lot more carbon dioxide in the blood than you might imagine, which means that you can control your acidity just by breathing, and that becomes really important. So let's look. So this is where we talked about last time a little bit. We talked about circulation, how we have chemosensors in the medulla, in the brainstem, that sense high carbon dioxide. So when your blood has a really high carbon dioxide level or high acidity, so that high pH, it's going to stimulate you to take deeper breaths and increase your breathing speed. So we'll talk about that in a second. So you can also, your arteries can sense very low oxygen. So remember that we talked about this last time, we talked about blood pressure, but it also works with carbon dioxide. The chemosensors in our major arteries sense very low oxygen by sensing that really high carbon dioxide or high acidity, and stimulate can then get, so it's kind of like it's a two-step thing. So either the medulla itself can determine that through the chemosensors that you need to start breathing more, or your arteries can figure it out and send a signal to the medulla, and then the medulla will start making you breathe more. We also have these things called stretch receptors in our lung wall to limit inspiration. So if you've ever taken a breath and then realized, well, I don't know if you realized it, but if you ever been told to take a deep breath, take a really deep breath, and you don't realize we can fill your lungs up more and more and more than you might have imagined. But that's not necessarily good for the acidity because you're kind of holding it in and you're not allowing oxygen and carbon dioxide to change places. So we have these stretch receptors in our lungs to limit how much you can inspire, how much you can take in through your air. So that's a very quick and dirty explanation of the respiratory system. So let's talk about some pathology. So what happens when stuff goes bad? So if you've ever had an asthma attack, if you have asthma, what is actually happening? So we have allergens that cause bronchial constriction. So our bronchi, when they think that something very bad is happening and they want to protect you, they'll close up, okay? And so because they're a lot smaller, it takes a lot longer for air to get in and out of these tubes. And you have to be able to open them up again so you can breathe properly, okay? So this kind of looks like the whole thing is being strangled when really it's just trying to prevent something horrible from getting into your lungs when really it's nothing horrible. And so we have inhalers, they're of albuterol, that are filled with bronchial dilators. So one of the very first kinds of asthma medication was coffee. And so people would smell coffee beans and it would actually relieve their asthma symptoms. It turns out we have taste buds in our bronchioles. They don't taste so much as they just detect bitter things, and for some reason that opens up the tubes. So that's an old way people used to figure this out, which I thought was interesting. Another pathology is pneumonia. This is a buildup of fluid and white blood cells in the alveoli due to a bacterial or viral infection. So you have a virus or a bacteria that comes in, it starts filling up those alveoli with fluid, and if those alveoli are filled with fluid, they can't fill with air, and then you can't breathe as well, and then just kind of everything goes downhill from there. This is a very common cause of death in the elderly. Often if you're just kind of sitting and you're not moving around, it's hard to, well, if you're in an enclosed place with other people who are sick, it's really easy to get pneumonia. Okay, what about tuberculosis? What is going on there? So when I lived in Texas, nobody talked about tuberculosis unless you're reading like a Victorian novel like Jane Eyre or something. But this is, there's a lot of history going on with TB. It used to kill so many people. Now in California, when you're getting a job, anytime you work with the public, you have to get a TB test. And it's because it's such an intense, oh my goodness, I'm losing words. Very contagious disease. Okay, so the reason why, so it used to be that spitting was outlawed because people who were sick would spit on the ground, and then ladies with really long skirts would drag their skirts through that infected spit and then take it home with them. So skirts started getting shorter, and people started getting fined for spitting because of tuberculosis. So what is tuberculosis? Tuberculosis is a kind of bacteria that infects the alveoli, much like in pneumonia. But what happens is you get these big nodules that start growing, not modules, that's what we're watching, and then they burst, and then when they burst, they start infecting other parts of the body, and then that bursts and infects other parts of the body, and you start to waste away because your immune system is so busy fighting all of these things. And so TB used to be called wasting disease because people, they couldn't eat, they would just like waste away into nothingness until they died. So what about cystic fibrosis? So cystic fibrosis is a genetic disorder where it's a genetic mutation in an ion transport protein. So if this is the lung cell, and here's the air coming in, okay, and here is the mucus that is protecting you from any nastiness coming in. So, if you have a problem with how much salt is being moved around, then you can't regulate that mucus layer, is what it comes down to. So somebody with cystic fibrosis has a lot more thickened mucus, and that's really, really hard to clear. So there's no way to cure this. There's nothing you can do about it. It's horrible. They basically drown in their own mucus. So the only way to really deal with this is to get a lung transplant. And it's really hard to get a lung transplant, and you have to be incredibly healthy. But how can you be healthy if you haven't been able to pull enough oxygen out of the air for so long? It's a very sad disease. Okay, so our last one we're going to talk about is emphysema, our last pathology. So this is where the alveoli just break down. And this is, once they break down, you can't use them for any kind of surface area for gas exchange. And so you're not pulling in as much oxygen as you were before. It's incurable. There's no way to go back and fix these alveoli once they've died. And it's progressive, so as they start to die, this more and more of the tissue starts to die, and it's usually caused by smoking. Okay, there are a couple genetic disorders that can cause this, but most of the time it's caused by smoking. You can live with oxygen tanks if this happens. You have to be really, really careful, and you have to only do this if you've quit smoking because these can blow up. And the problem is that you have to have more, every time you breathe in, you have to have more oxygen present in each inhalation because you don't have as much area to pull oxygen out anymore as you did before. So what does this look like if this is what normal tissue looks like? Emphysema, where the tissue just straight up dies, is going to look like this. Tuberculosis, you see all these little black dots, which are just full of bacteria waiting to burst and just start taking over other places. And then pneumonia, where it just fills up with fluid, is going to look something like this. So the #1 preventable cause of death in the U.S. is smoking, because this is just nicotine is so, and all the stuff they put in cigarettes is really, really bad for your lungs. So if this is what a healthy lung looks like, this is what a very advanced stage smoker's lung is going to look like. So we talked about how nicotine paralyzes the cilia of the respiratory tract. It takes about a month for those to be cleared. Tar is filled with carcinogens. Anytime you have a carcinogen in your body, you start mutating things, you're more likely to get cancer. Nicotine constricts the terminal alveoli, which leads to destruction and emphysema. It's just, and you know what, the way that they finally got people to stop, so smoking isn't as in favor as it used to be. Thank goodness. One of the ways they finally got people to stop being so obsessed with smoking, so they didn't care that it led to cancer, or emphysema, or heart attacks, or strokes. All the data that says it would do that didn't convince people. It was when they started telling them, also, it causes wrinkles, that people were like, oh, well, screw that, I'm not smoking anymore if it's going to make me get wrinkles. And you know what? Whatever it takes to make people stop smoking, that's fine. So, but I always thought it was really funny that there's all this data about how bad smoking is for you, and it wasn't until they started telling people that it gives you wrinkles that it really started to decline in sales. So, that's enough on the respiratory system, I think. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you next time. Bye!